Miss Marple and the Murderous Book Club. Chapter 1. The village of Nether Keys had always prided itself on its quiet dignity. With its ivy-covered cottages, neatly swept lanes, and a vicar who seemed to have been born wearing his cassock, the place gave off the sort of serene charm that painters adored and busy minds escaped to. Life moved gently in Nether Keys, like the slow turning of pages in a well-loved book. But it was the village's book club that gave its ladies purpose. A monthly gathering in the drawing-room of Ivy Cottage, hosted by none other than the formidable Mrs. Geraldine Marchmont, widowed, wealthy, and possessing opinions as sharp as the cut of her bone china. Mrs. Marchmont presided over discussions with an iron teapot and a gaze that had withered lesser women. It was on a Thursday afternoon that the club convened to discuss Murder in the Marshlands, a recent crime novel that had swept through polite circles. Mrs. Marchmont had, naturally, loathed it. Utter nonsense, she declared, pouring tea with the confidence of a woman who knew the milk came second. The murderer being the gardener, it's positively gauche. Real crimes are never so conveniently solved. Across the room, Miss Lavinia Price, a retired schoolteacher with a penchant for spy novels, tittered nervously. I found it rather exciting, Geraldine. The twist in Chapter 23 was quite unexpected. Because it was unearned, Mrs. Marchmont snapped. Any mystery that relies on surprise alone has no substance. Miss Marple, seated near the lace-curtained window, stirred her tea in silence. Her blue eyes, bright with an innocent curiosity, flicked from one face to another. She said nothing, but her attention rarely strayed from the undercurrents. Mrs. Marchmont's habitual need to dominate, Lavinia's slight flinch whenever the word gardener was mentioned, and the curious absence of Mr. Simon Delaford, the club's only male member. The group carried on, skirting literature in favour of local gossip. Miss Felicity Ashcroft, the vicar's daughter, leaned in with theatrical relish. Did you hear about the new tenants at Willow House? Americans, apparently. The man's some sort of novelist. Probably writes filth, muttered Mrs. Marchmont. Modern fiction is all sordid affairs, and communism disguised as character. Development. Miss Marple allowed a ghost of a smile to play at the corner of her lips. She had once overheard Mrs. Marchmont refer to Wuthering Heights as common, and suspected the woman wouldn't know a classic if it threw itself off. Amour, as the tea cooled and the biscuits dwindled, a tension began to settle in the room, like a storm cloud just beyond the hedgerow. Mrs. Marchmont's critiques had grown particularly sharp that afternoon, cutting into every comment with surgical precision. She dismissed Miss Price's fondness for Agatha Christie, scoffed at Felicity's mention of American authors, and even made a veiled jab at Mrs. Townsend's husband's recent employment trouble. Miss Marple noticed how the smiles grew tighter, how Felicity's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her cup, how Mrs. Townsend's eyes flicked to the clock more than once, and how Lavinia Price had suddenly gone rather pale when asked about her opinion on the perfect literary crime. No one said it aloud, but the room had soured, and then, with no more warning than the clink of a dropped teaspoon, it happened. Mrs. Marchmont stood abruptly, teacup still in hand. Well, I suppose we'll never have proper literature again, in this country if we keep rewarding mediocrity. Oh, she faltered. Her hand spasmed The delicate porcelain cup slipped from her grasp and shattered against the carpet. Her eyes widened in confusion. Her breath caught halfway to a gasp. And then she collapsed, striking the edge of the coffee table before crumpling to the floor. Gasps filled the room. Felicity screamed. Lavinia Price froze in place, one hand raised, as if to ward off something unseen. Miss Marple, moving far quicker than one would expect of a woman her age, was already kneeling beside the body, her fingers pressed gently against the neck. No pulse. "She's dead," Miss Marple said quietly. Then, with a strange calmness in her voice, she added, "And I very much doubt it was natural." The drawing-room, once filled with literary bickering and polite laughter, had turned as silent as the grave. Chapter 2. Inspector Crail arrived at Ivy Cottage before sunset. A tall, angular man with a permanent squint as though every statement were suspect, he surveyed the genteel crime scene with barely concealed irritation. Netherkeys rarely offered much beyond petty thefts or quarrels over hedgerows. Murder was unwelcome, especially in parlours that smelled of lavender polish and overbrewed Darjeeling. Mrs. Marchmont's body had already been respectfully moved. To the settee, a crocheted shawl draped across her as if to preserve a final shred of dignity. The teacup remained in fragments by the hearth. The tea tray, untouched since the moment of collapse, sat on the sideboard like a silent witness. "Everyone here?" Crail asked curtly, glancing around the room. Miss Marple nodded. "No one's left. I insisted." Her voice was mild, but firm. Miss Felicity Ashcroft had taken to pacing near the window, arms wrapped tightly across her chest. Mrs. Townsend sat stiffly beside the piano, blinking too often. Lavinia Price looked pale and strangely composed, her hands folded over her lap like a student awaiting punishment. "I was just saying," Mrs. Townsend offered quietly, "that Geraldine had been in fine health. She'd mentioned a touch of indigestion this morning, but certainly nothing life-threatening." Crail sniffed. "Indigestion doesn't tend to kill quite so theatrically, madam." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the overturned teaspoon near the tea tray. It had fallen at an odd angle, handle toward the edge, as if dropped in haste rather than placed. Her fingers brushed her chin in thought, but she said nothing. "Who poured the tea?" Crail asked sharply. A pause. "I did," said Lavinia. Price, her voice steady, if distant. "As always. And who prepared it?" "Cook brewed the pot," she replied. "I simply carried it in and served." "Did Mrs. Marchmont have her usual cup?" "She always insisted on the rose-patterned porcelain, the one with the slightly chipped rim. No one else would touch it." Crail jotted something in his notebook. "And you say you saw nothing unusual?" "I noticed nothing at the time," Lavinia said carefully. "But, I suppose, well, she had seemed more waspish than usual. I assumed it was just the book choice." "I heard her complain of a bitter aftertaste in the tea," Miss Marple said softly, "just before she stood." Crail turned toward her. "You're certain?" She said it quietly, almost to herself. "But I make a habit of listening." "Of course you do," Crail muttered, not unkindly. He had encountered Miss Marple's quiet capabilities before, though she never presumed to direct an investigation. Her presence always signalled that someone's neat lies would eventually fray. Miss Felicity, who had remained unusually silent, suddenly blurted, It must have been an accident. Geraldine had a weak heart, didn't she? No, said Mrs. Townsend, her voice brittle. In fact, she often bragged about her marching heart, said it was the only thing keeping her sharp at her age. Miss Marple observed how Felicity's hand twitched at that, gripping the edge of her sleeve again. Not guilt, no, not quite, but nerves born of more than grief. Crail sighed. No visible injuries, but we'll have the coroner's report soon enough. Until then, no one is to leave the village. Understood? The ladies murmured agreement, though none of them looked pleased. Mrs. Marchmont's death had unsettled more than nerves. It had unseated something in the structure of Netherkeys itself. Her scathing opinions, though widely disliked, had acted as a strange kind of glue. Now, without her, cracks began to widen. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "may I ask who fetched you?" "Mrs. Townsend's maid. Smart girl. Ran straight to the station." Miss Marple inclined her head, then stepped toward the tea-tray. She did not touch anything, merely observed. The pot remained half full. 4 cups poured, 1 still untouched. "Odd," she murmured. "Something wrong?" Crail asked. She smiled vaguely. Only that Mrs. Marchmont was not one to leave anything half done. She never failed to comment if someone failed to finish their tea. Yet 1 cup remains full, and no one has mentioned whose it was. Mrs. Townsend hesitated. "That was Simon Delaford's. He was meant to join us, but sent word he'd be late. Business in town, he said. Left the note with the vicar, I believe." Crail raised a brow. "A man missing from a room where a woman drops dead after tea. That's a fine coincidence." Miss Marple said nothing, but her gaze lingered on the untouched cup. There was something deliberate about it, something that tugged at her memory. Not the absence itself, but what it implied. As the inspector began taking final notes, Miss Marple gently stepped outside. The air had cooled, the village already buzzing with whispers behind curtains and garden gates. She glanced toward the path that led to Willow House. The new tenants, the American novelist, a missing book club member, and a woman dead with a cup, still warm in her hand. A picture was beginning to form, but not yet clearly. Not yet. Chapter 3. The next morning dawned with a crisp chill that clung to the hedges and rooftops of Netherkeys like frost on secrets. Word of Mrs. Marchmont's sudden death had fluttered through the village faster than any telegram ever could. By breakfast, the bakery queue was abuzz with theories, and by luncheon, every parlour seemed to hold its own version of events. Miss Marple, as was her habit, took a quiet walk to the green. She greeted the butcher's boy with a pleasant smile, paused to admire the daffodils by the chapel wall, and arrived at the vicarage just after 10. It was not chance. It rarely was. Reverend Clemmings, a man whose sermons were shorter than his, apologies, welcomed her with warm bewilderment. "Ah, Miss Marple, dreadful business yesterday. Simply dreadful." "I thought I might offer a comforting ear to poor Miss Felicity," she replied gently. "I imagine she's quite shaken." "She is indeed," the vicar sighed. "She's in the study gathering hymnals. Please, do speak with her. She trusts you." Miss Marple entered the study with a soft knock. Miss Felicity looked up from a small stack of papers, her usually bright expression drawn and distracted. "Oh, Miss Marple, I suppose I'm not good company this morning." "Nonsense," said Miss Marple, taking the armchair across from her. "You've seen a great deal. One mustn't expect composure after something so abrupt." Felicity nodded, biting her lip. She was so sharp, but she didn't deserve that. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "No one does. But tell me, dear, how did Mrs. Marchmont seem before she arrived?" Felicity blinked. "Before? At church, perhaps. Or when you saw her earlier this week. I ran into her on Tuesday at the grocer's. She complained about the apples being soft and said the village had gone to rot since the war. Seemed her usual self." "And Mr. Delaford?" Miss Marple asked lightly. Felicity stiffened almost imperceptibly. "He didn't say much. He's been distant lately. Distracted." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Distracted? He used to contribute so much to the group. Readings, debates. Lately he just nods along, skips meetings." "Yet he intended to come yesterday." "Yes. He left a note with Reverend Clemmings that morning. Something about a train delay. Said he might still make it." Miss Marple's fingers laced together. "Curious, isn't it?" Felicity hesitated. "I suppose." They sat a moment in silence. "Did he have a quarrel with Mrs. Marchmont?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Felicity's eyes widened. "Not that I know of, but she did humiliate him once, over his novel." Miss Marple's brow rose slightly. "She called it sentimental drivel during a meeting last month. He didn't respond, just smiled, but it wasn't his real smile." Miss Marple stood gently. "Thank you, my dear. You've helped more than you know." She didn't press further. Sometimes it was better to leave a door half open than to force it wide. Later, she strolled toward Willow House, a tidy cottage with ivy that hadn't yet grown bold enough to climb. A woman in a navy cardigan stood outside, fussing with a flower box. "Mrs. Delaford?" Miss Marple asked kindly. The woman turned, startled. "Yes? I'm Jane Marple. I believe we've not been properly introduced." "Of course. Simon mentioned you, said you were the cleverest woman in the county." She smiled, but her eyes held something tired. Miss Marple returned the expression. "I'd hoped to speak with your husband. He's in town still. Took the early train. Said he needed air after, well, you know." Miss Marple nodded. "Understandably. It's all rather upsetting." Mrs. Delaford's smile faltered. "He blames himself. You know, he never liked Mrs. Marchmont, but he still meant to go yesterday. It's shaken him. You received no word until afterward?" "No. I assumed he'd changed his mind." A pause. "I suppose he's not a man to dwell on guilt," Miss Marple said mildly. Mrs. Delaford looked down at the flower box. "You'd be surprised." Miss Marple took her leave soon after, but her mind was weaving threads together. A comment dismissed, a teacup untouched, a man absent, a humiliation not forgotten. Back at home, she sat with her knitting, eyes distant. The village whispered of poison, of curses, of sudden heart failure. But Miss Marple had heard something else. In the overlapping recollections and half-formed alibis, she heard something inconsistent. Not what was said, but how it was said, and what wasn't said at all. Chapter 4. By Sunday, the unease in Nether Keys had rooted itself like ivy beneath the church pews. The vicar's sermon on forgiveness fell flat, every verse sounding vaguely accusatory when heard through the filter of recent events. The death of Mrs. Marchmont had not just unsettled, it had shifted something deeper. Whispers grew louder, glances lingered too long, trust began to fray. Inspector Crail returned to the village with a grim expression and an armful of early lab results. The post-mortem, though preliminary, had ruled out natural causes. Something had tainted Mrs. Marchmont's tea. Poison, an old-fashioned one, digitalis, extracted from foxglove, not uncommon in the countryside, where the plant grew wild and lovely along the hedgerows, its bell-like blossoms belying their danger. Crail wasted little time assembling the key witnesses once more, this time in the smaller sitting room of Ivy Cottage, now stripped of its former warmth. "I'm going to speak plainly," he began. "This wasn't an accident. It was murder." A few gasps, a muffled sob from Mrs. Townsend. Felicity turned away, her hands twisting in her lap. The poison was delivered in tea. Only Mrs. Marchmont's cup was affected. That tells us something. It wasn't random. It was personal. He let the silence stretch, eyes scanning the room. Miss Marple watched, saying nothing, her needles clicking quietly beneath her shawl. "Let's talk motive," Crail continued. "Mrs. Marchmont wasn't beloved, was she?" "She was difficult," Lavinia Price admitted, "but that doesn't make us murderers." "No," said Crail, "but it makes my job easier." He turned toward Mrs. Townsend. "Your husband, he lost his position recently. Any truth to the rumour Mrs. Marchmont helped force his resignation?" Mrs. Townsend flinched. "That's ridiculous. She had opinions, yes, but Harold's troubles were bureaucratic." Crail raised an eyebrow. "Yet you didn't deny she might have intervened?" Mrs. Townsend didn't respond. He pivoted. "Miss Price, long-standing friend, weren't you?" Lavinia's lips thinned. "More long-standing acquaintance. Geraldine didn't have friends. She had a captive audience. You served the tea. I've done so for years. Then you'd have opportunity." Miss Marple looked up briefly at that, not at Lavinia, but at Crail. The tone of his questioning had hardened too quickly. He was grasping at surface logic, eager for the first clean narrative. "And Miss Ashcroft," Crail continued, "you were particularly shaken." Felicity looked up, startled. "Of course I was. Your father's parishioners say Mrs. Marchmont often criticised you in public." "She criticised everyone," Felicity snapped. "She once told Mrs. Downey her pudding was an assault on the concept of dessert. It wasn't personal. She embarrassed you, maybe pushed too far. That's absurd." But her cheeks had flushed and her voice trembled at the edges. Miss Marple made a small, thoughtful sound. Not enough to interrupt, just enough to observe how Felicity shrank under the weight of implication. Crail exhaled, and then there's Mr. Delaford, still conveniently absent. "He telephoned this morning," said Mrs. Delaford from the corner. "Said he's staying with his cousin in Oxford. Needed time to clear his head." "Curious," Crail muttered, scribbling. Mrs. Marple glanced at the window. Outside, the foxglove bloomed along the garden path, lovely, dangerous, and easily missed, unless one knew what to look for. Crail stood. "I'll be making house visits over the next few days. Until we have a clear account of everyone's movements and motives, no one is above suspicion." The group dispersed. Miss Marple lingered. She stepped to the tea cabinet, eyes scanning the neat rows of canisters. She reached, not for the obvious ones, but for the smaller, unlabeled tin tucked at the back. A faint trace of crushed leaves clung to its rim. She didn't touch it, only noted its presence. Not damning, but suggestive. Outside, the village air had turned damp with the threat of rain. People passed one another with polite nods and suspicious glances. The book club had once been a place for literature and gossip. Now it was a stage, and everyone feared the script. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the clack of her knitting the only sound. She had seen it before, how easily guilt could be constructed from circumstance. But she had also seen how often the truly guilty remained quiet, watching the chaos unfold exactly as they intended. The murderer was clever, but not clever enough. Chapter 5. The rain arrived by mid-afternoon, soft and persistent, drumming gently on slate roofs and turning garden paths into glistening ribbons. It washed the streets clean of villagers, but not of their unease. Miss Marple, however, did not mind the weather. She liked how it made the village quieter, how it softened movement, encouraged stillness, and made even the most hurried souls slow down just enough to reveal themselves. She had arranged a visit that day, not to Ivy Cottage or Willow House, but to the vicarage kitchen, where young Molly, the maid employed by Mrs. Townsend, had been sent on an errand. Miss Marple. Molly blinked in surprise as she entered through the back door, arms laden with a parcel of bread. I didn't expect— Forgive the intrusion, dear. I was simply hoping for a bit of conversation while the kettle boiled. You know how these dreary days can be. Molly's suspicion melted quickly. Few could resist Miss Marple's gentle manner, especially when paired with the promise of shortbread biscuits and warm tea. You were quite brave the other day, Miss Marple said lightly, once they were seated, running for the inspector so promptly. Molly flushed. I just did what seemed right. It was quick thinking, Miss Marple said kindly. Did you see anyone on your way to the station? No one, really. Oh, but I passed the vicar's. Cat, of course, nearly tripped on him. And old Mr. Clemens was trimming his hedge, but that's nothing unusual. Miss Marple nodded. And earlier, before the meeting, did you serve at Ivy Cottage? No, ma'am. Cook did. I helped set the table earlier in the day, though. Did you notice anything odd while doing so? Molly frowned. Odd, ma'am. Miss Marple waited. Well, now that you mention it, she said slowly, Mrs. Marchmont was fussier than usual. She kept asking if the rose cup had been polished properly. She seemed unusually concerned with it, yes. And she had it out on the tray hours before. The others arrived. Said it was her personal vessel, whatever that meant. I thought it was just her usual dramatics. Miss Marple nodded again, more thoughtfully this time. And the sugar, was it on the table already? No, Molly said. Mrs. Townsend brought it in later, one of those little cut-glass dishes. I remember because the lid didn't fit quite right. It wobbled when she set it down. Ah, said Miss Marple softly. That evening, while the rest of the village sought shelter from the weather, Miss Marple visited Ivy Cottage again. She told Inspector Crail she was returning a borrowed shawl to Mrs. Townsend. In truth, she had noticed something small and easily missed, a detail everyone had accepted without question. She asked to see the tea set again. I don't see the point, Crail muttered, but allowed it. Miss Marple approached the sideboard. The rose-patterned cup had been removed for analysis, but the others remained. All plain porcelain. Identical. All except one. She picked up a saucer. White, clean, and very slightly larger than the rest, only by a fraction. Then she opened the sugar dish. The lid, as Molly had said, did not sit flush. She tilted it. Inside were only the barest remnants of sugar. But caught at the bottom, almost invisible against the crystal, was something else. A pale greenish fleck, no larger than a breadcrumb. She said nothing, merely replaced the lid, letting it rest askew once more. As she turned to leave, she paused beside Crail. I wonder, she said quietly, if you've noticed how often we confuse habit with safety. Crail blinked. Come again. We trust the familiar, she said. A favourite teacup. A sugar bowl we've used 100 times, but murder, Inspector. Murder only needs one deviation. Later that night, at home by her fire, Miss Marple made a note in her gardening journal. An odd place for an observation, but one she found comforting. The foxglove thrives in shaded soil. It does not announce itself with scent or thorns, but grows quietly, with purpose, just like guilt. She folded the page. The clue had been laid bare. Now, it was only a matter of who had placed it there, and why. Chapter 6. The following day, a fog rolled in, settling thickly across the village like a blanket. It was the sort of weather that made the roads seem longer, the corners darker, and the houses more isolated. No one seemed to want to venture far outside. Inside Ivy Cottage, however, the stillness was interrupted only by the sharp click of Miss Marple's knitting needles and the quiet murmurs of the police inspector as he paced from one side of the drawing-room to the other. I'll admit, Crail said as he leaned against the mantelpiece, this whole situation is starting to feel wrong, like I'm being led by my nose to a conclusion I can't see clearly. Miss Marple did not look up from her work. Sometimes the clues are so ordinary that we overlook them. The tea, Crail muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. Yes, it was poison, but it's too simple, too easy. Miss Marple gave him a thoughtful look. We all tend to favour simplicity. It's comforting, isn't it? Especially when the world is full of noise. What do you mean by that? He asked sharply. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose to her feet, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. The social fabric of a village like this, Netherkeys, always looks deceptively neat, Inspector, but underneath it's full of fraying threads. These people, they aren't just friends or neighbours. They're people with histories, resentments and fears that go beyond the surface. Crail shook his head. You're saying it's not. The tea, then. I'm saying it's not the cup. It's the hands that pour it. As Crail stood in silence, digesting her words, a knock at the door interrupted the moment. Miss Marple glanced at him, her expression unreadable, and gestured toward the hallway. It seems you've another visitor. The door opened, and a man stepped into the room, tall, dark-haired, and with an air of distracted elegance. It was Simon Delaford, the missing member of the book club, returning as unexpectedly as his absence. I apologize for the delay, Simon said, his tone light, but his eyes betraying a hint of strain. I was, as I explained, caught up in a series of meetings in Oxford. My cousin's affairs have been complicated. Crail eyed him with mild suspicion, but Miss Marple smiled politely. "No need to apologize, Mr. Delaford. You've arrived just in time, I believe." Simon hesitated, glancing at the still open door, his eyes flicking momentarily toward the gathered guests. "I heard about Mrs. Marchmont's passing. I'm terribly sorry to have missed the funeral." Crail stood straighter. "Yes, well, your absence at the meeting was noted. Care to explain that, Mr. Delaford?" Simon's face tightened for a moment, but he recovered with a forced smile. "I was delayed. I didn't expect her to pass so suddenly." "It's curious," Miss Marple said gently, "that you returned just as the investigation heats up." Simon's eyes flickered, but he nodded. "I assure you, I have no wish to be the subject of rumours. I merely came back to pay my respects." As he sat, Miss Marple noticed the slight shift in his posture, a subtle but telling movement. She could almost see the weight of something shifting beneath the surface, a hidden discomfort perhaps, or a need to control how he was perceived. "Tell me, Mr. Delaford," she continued, "you mentioned before that Mrs. Marchmont had criticised your book. How did that make you feel?" He stiffened just slightly, but smiled through it. She had opinions. She was very vocal about them, but then again, she was vocal about many things. "And how did you respond to her opinion?" "I didn't. She was entitled to her views. In fact, I rather enjoyed the sparring, but she was, at times, less charitable than most." Miss Marple studied him, her eyes sharp beneath the softness of her gaze. "But not the type to hold grudges, I imagine." "No, not at all," Simon replied too quickly, and Miss Marple caught the subtle unease that flickered in his eyes. "I've never held grudges. Not over something so trivial." Crail took a step forward. "Mr. Delaford, you're a man of reason, I'm sure. Would you care to share your whereabouts the day Mrs. Marchmont passed? We'd like to get everything sorted." Simon shifted, glancing out the window as though the fog outside might hold the answer. "I was in town," he said slowly, "meeting with my cousin. I didn't think I needed to explain. After all, the note I left with Reverend Clemmings should have cleared that up. It was rather cryptic, don't you think?" Crail countered. "A simple 'I'll be late' doesn't clarify much. Did you see anyone while you were in town?" "No," Simon answered too quickly. "I was busy with private matters." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She had noticed something else, how Simon had avoided mentioning anyone by name. No mention of his cousin or the specifics of his meetings. The room fell silent as Crail made a note in his notebook. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, her mind spinning with the subtle contradictions in Simon's answers. He had seemed genuine enough in his apology, but there was a guardedness to him, a carefulness in his words that didn't quite sit right. The quiet tension was broken by the ringing of the front bell. Another visitor, no doubt. Another layer to peel away. Miss Marple gave Simon a courteous smile. "I hope you won't mind staying a little longer, Mr. Delaford. The inspector may have more questions." Simon rose with a thin smile, his shoulders tight. Of course, as the door closed behind him, Miss Marple stood and turned back to Crail, who was still scribbling in his notebook. Something's not quite right with Mr. Delaford, Miss Marple mused. But it's not his absence that matters. It's his arrival? Crail frowned. You think he's guilty? Not guilty necessarily, she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. But he's hiding something, and I have a feeling it's not just a matter of a book review. She glanced outside, where the fog was thickening even more. I do believe the social fabric is starting to tear, Inspector. The question is, who will be caught in the unravelling? Chapter 7. The following afternoon, a new noise disrupted the quiet of Nether Keys. It was the sort of noise that carried in the damp, heavy air, the sound of an unmistakable, steady knock on Miss Marple's door. She had been seated by the fire, enjoying her knitting when the summons came. The figure on her doorstep was familiar, though not a face Miss Marple had expected so soon. It was Simon Delaford, his face pale, his posture stiff with tension. The usual air of self-assurance had all but evaporated, leaving him looking unusually uncertain, almost anxious. "Miss Marple," he said quickly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Miss Marple set her knitting aside with deliberate slowness, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Of course, Mr. Delaford. Come in, won't you? Tea?" Simon shook his head, his eyes darting to the window as though the fog outside might conceal something he was unwilling to face. "No tea. He stopped himself, visibly gathering his thoughts. "I've made a terrible mistake." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment, the soft crackling of the fire, the only sound between them. "Go on," she said gently. "I'm afraid something I said earlier." "Well, it wasn't the truth," Simon confessed, his voice strained. "When I said I was with my cousin in Oxford, I wasn't. I was here in the village. I was at Willow House." Miss Marple did not react immediately, giving him space to continue. He shifted uncomfortably but did not meet her gaze. "I had an argument with Geraldine, Miss Marple. A horrible, petty argument, but, well, it escalated. She said some things about my work, about me as a person. She told me that my novel was mediocre, and that I should never write again." His voice faltered, but he pressed on, clearly struggling with the admission. "I left that morning, intending to go to Oxford, but I didn't. I stayed here. I wandered the village, unsure of what to do. I didn't think it would matter." "But it did matter," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze unwavering. "You were here when Mrs. Marchmont died. Yet you did not speak of this when the inspector questioned you. Why not?" Simon's face twisted with guilt. "I didn't want anyone to think I was involved. I was already embarrassed enough by the argument. It seemed so trivial, so beneath me. But now I see how it looks." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully, the faintest shadow of a smile appearing on her lips. "It's not the argument, Mr. Delaford, but your decision to remain hidden that raises questions. You could have said you were here, but instead you lied." Simon looked as though the weight of the admission was too much to bear. "I see that now." Miss Marple studied him in silence for a moment before responding. "You weren't the only one who lied, though, were you?" Simon's eyes flickered. "What do you mean?" "Your absence wasn't the only thing that raised suspicion, Mr. Delaford. It's the inconsistencies in the statements of everyone involved." Simon blinked, clearly lost. What are you suggesting? I suggest, Miss Marple said calmly, that Mrs. Marchmont's death was not simply a random act. It was orchestrated. Perhaps more than one person was involved. Simon took a step back, the blood draining from his face. Involved? You mean? But before he could finish his sentence, there was a sharp knock at the door. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the entrance, and she stood up. The moment had shifted. Her tone changed. "Come in," she called softly. The door opened, and Inspector Crail stepped inside. He gave Simon a brief nod, his gaze assessing before turning to Miss Marple. "I thought you ought to know, Miss Marple," Crail said, his voice tight with the weight of his discovery. "We found something in the woods just beyond the vicarage." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "What exactly did you find?" "A body," Crail answered bluntly. "Not Mrs. Marchmont, but a body nonetheless." The words landed like a stone in the quiet room. Simon stiffened. "Another murder?" "Not exactly," Crail muttered. "Not unless you count the way it was disposed of." He paused for a moment, glancing between Miss Marple and Simon. "It was a woman, Mrs. Marchmont's maid, Molly." Miss Marple did not flinch. She merely looked at Crail with measured calm. "Murdered?" Crail nodded grimly. "We're still determining the cause, but the circumstances don't suggest an accident." Simon took a half-step back, visibly shaken. No, that can't be right." Miss Marple held his gaze. Murder often carries a kind of inevitability. Once one thread is pulled, it begins to unravel. "And the maid," Crail continued. "She had access to the tea." "Yes," Miss Marple answered softly. "But more importantly, she was in a position to witness things, and that may have made her a target." Crail gave her a hard look. "And now what do we do?" "We follow the threads," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm, but with an underlying strength. "There are more lies than truths in this village, Inspector, but we've already begun to see the truth beneath them." The room seemed to hold its breath as the implication hung between them. Simon turned, pacing again, his face pale. Miss Marple's eyes never left him. "You may have told me part of the truth, Mr. Delaford, but now it seems the consequences of that day have gone beyond your argument with Mrs. Marchmont. You didn't just conceal a mistake. You may have concealed something far darker." Crail's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Delaford—" Miss Marple held up a hand, stopping him. "Not yet. But the more we learn, the clearer it becomes that the death of Mrs. Marchmont was just the beginning. The threads are tangled, Inspector, but we must continue to pull." Chapter 8. The fog that had lingered for days showed no signs of letting up, and the air in Netherkeys seemed to hang heavier with each passing hour. Yet amidst the gloom, Miss Marple remained steady, as always, in her quiet corner by the fire. Her knitting sat forgotten beside her, replaced by a neat stack of notes and observations, each one part of the puzzle she had been quietly assembling. She had learned much in the past few days. Mrs. Marchmont's death had set off a chain of events that, though tragic, had revealed more than she had expected. Lies, secrets, and unspoken truths had begun to surface, each one connected to the others in ways no one had anticipated. The discovery of Molly's body had shifted the investigation into darker territory. It was clear now that someone was orchestrating these deaths with precision, carefully manipulating those around them. But who? The answer had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of misdirection. But Miss Marple had not yet made her move. She had waited patiently for the right moment to test those involved. It was evening when the others gathered again in the drawing-room of Ivy Cottage. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the walls. The atmosphere was thick, with tension, each person aware that the game was changing. Miss Marple had invited Simon Delaford, Felicity Ashcroft, Lavinia Price, and Mrs. Townsend to join her. Inspector Crail, though present, remained quiet as Miss Marple turned to the group with a smile that, despite its warmth, held a sharpness beneath it. "I'm sure you've all noticed by now," she began, her voice calm but firm, "how the facts of this case don't add up. There are too many contradictions, too many discrepancies in everyone's stories. What I need, however, is for each of you to tell me exactly what you know, without hiding anything." The room grew silent as Miss Marple's eyes moved from face to face. Simon, of course, looked the most uncomfortable, his fingers twitching at his side. Felicity shifted uneasily in her seat, while Lavinia stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Miss Marple," Felicity said hesitantly. "What do you expect us to say?" "Everything, my dear," Miss Marple replied simply. "The truth, however inconvenient. It's time for honesty." The inspector shifted in his seat. His interest piqued. He had been an observer up until now, allowing Miss Marple to take the lead. But now he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with anticipation. Felicity looked toward Simon, then back to Miss Marple. "There's nothing more to tell. We've all said what we know." "You haven't," Miss Marple said quietly, her gaze never leaving Felicity. "You know more than you're letting on, Miss Ashcroft." Felicity's face paled, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate. It was enough. Miss Marple had seen it. The slight shift in posture, the tightening of the lips. "You knew," Miss Marple continued softly, "that Molly had been involved in something more than just serving tea. You knew she had been acting as a sort of witness to things she shouldn't have. Did you ever stop to wonder why?" Felicity opened her mouth but closed it again, caught by the question. There was something deeper. Miss Marple could see it, now, a fear that had nothing to do with the surface story. "I didn't want to get involved," Felicity said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Molly, she had been in the habit of overhearing things. She knew about certain matters between me and my father, and Mrs. Marchmont, too. She had threatened to tell everyone about the letter." "The letter?" Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with recognition. Felicity nodded, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "It was an old letter from my father to Mrs. Marchmont. Nothing scandalous, but it would have raised questions. It was a time when things were less settled. If the letter came to light, it would ruin everything." "Did Molly threaten to expose you?" Miss Marple asked. "She didn't have to," Felicity replied, her voice shaking now. "She just knew too much. I didn't want to, but I feared she would cause trouble. I wanted her to stay quiet." Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind processing the new piece of the puzzle. The fear in Felicity's voice was genuine. She hadn't been lying. She had been trying to protect herself and her family, even if it meant silencing Molly. But there was something more to her story. She wasn't the only one involved in these dark deeds. "Miss Ashcroft," Miss Marple said, her voice steady, "I believe you feared Molly. But I also believe someone else knew of her suspicions, and someone else took steps to ensure she never revealed what she knew." Felicity looked away, unable to meet Miss Marple's gaze. "You're not the only one with secrets, Miss Ashcroft," Miss Marple added, her tone gentle but cutting. "You've been too careful with your words. There's more to your story, more than just the letter. But the question is, who else knew?" The room fell silent again, the weight of the question hanging heavy in the air. Simon shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room, and Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. "Mrs. Townsend," Miss Marple said suddenly, turning her attention to the older woman. "You, too, have been concealing something." Mrs. Townsend blinked, as though startled by the accusation. What do you mean?" "You, too, had access to Molly," Miss Marple said, her voice cool but steady. "You knew what she was capable of. You knew that she could have unravelled some of your own secrets. Tell me, Mrs. Townsend, did you have anything to do with silencing her?" Mrs. Townsend's lips parted, and for the briefest moment Miss Marple saw fear in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "No," Mrs. Townsend said, her voice trembling. I never meant for anyone to die." "No," Miss Marple replied softly, "but someone did." Crail looked between the two women, his brow furrowed. "Is this your confession, Mrs. Townsend?" I didn't want to kill anyone," Mrs. Townsend whispered. "But when Molly started asking questions, I didn't know what else to do. I feared the consequences. She had too much on all of us." Miss Marple's gaze shifted, as though considering something more, something larger that she hadn't yet spoken aloud. "No one is truly innocent in this, are they?" she asked, almost rhetorically. Crail exchanged a look with her, his lips tight with realization. The final pieces were falling into place. Chapter 9. The room fell still, as if the entire village had held its breath in the moments that followed Miss Marple's words. Every eye in the room was fixed on Mrs. Townsend, whose shoulders had sagged under the weight of her confession. Her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean it to go this far," Mrs. Townsend said, her hands trembling. "But when Molly started asking questions, when she started digging into things she shouldn't—" "You killed her to protect yourself," Miss Marple interjected gently. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it, a finality. "You believed that if she spoke out, everything would unravel. Your secrets, your past, all of it." Mrs. Townsend's lips parted in protest, but she had no more defence. She simply nodded, her eyes brimming with regret. But Molly wasn't the only one who had a reason to silence Mrs. Marchmont, was she? Miss Marple continued, her gaze flicking briefly to Simon Delaford. "And neither were you, Miss Ashcroft." Felicity stiffened, and Simon's face remained as pale as the walls surrounding them. The tension was palpable, as though each person present feared they would be the next to crack under Miss Marple's scrutiny. Let us not forget, there were motives that stretched beyond just self-preservation, Miss Marple said, her tone shifting, becoming more pointed. It wasn't just Molly and Mrs. Townsend who had something to lose from Mrs. Marchmont's sharp tongue. Simon swallowed hard. "What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood and began to pace slowly around the room, her gaze lingering on each person in turn. "We've heard about your argument with Mrs. Marchmont, Mr. Delaford," Miss Marple continued, her voice smooth, almost casual. "How she humiliated you in front of the book club, how your novel was dismissed. Yet, despite this, you never openly confronted her. Why?" Simon's eyes flicked to the others in the room, as if searching for an escape. "It wasn't worth it." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But you didn't let it go. You never really let it go. And Mrs. Marchmont knew too much about your work, about your pride. You believed her opinion was damaging, and you took that insult to heart. Did you ever consider that perhaps it wasn't the book she was attacking, but you, personally?" Simon opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He was caught, trapped in the silence of his own guilt. "The truth is," Miss Marple continued, her voice cutting through the tension, "you all had something to lose. Mrs. Townsend's silence, Miss Ashcroft's letter, Mr. Delaford's wounded ego, and none of you could bear to let your secrets slip into the open." "But I didn't," Felicity began, her voice trembling. But Miss Marple held up a hand, stopping her. "You didn't intend to kill Mrs. Marchmont," Miss Marple said, gently. "But you certainly hoped she'd be silenced. All of you had reasons to want her out of the way, but none of you could act alone. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the final revelation to be laid bare." Miss Marple stopped pacing and turned toward them. Her expression softened as she spoke, her voice taking on a quieter tone. "There was a pattern all along, a subtle one hidden in plain sight," she said, "and the key to the entire case was the sugar bowl." The group exchanged puzzled glances. "Sugar?" Crail asked, his voice sceptical. "Yes. You see, it was no accident that Mrs. Marchmont's cup was poisoned," Miss Marple explained. "The sugar was poisoned, but only in the smallest amount. And it was placed there, deliberately, for someone to find. It wasn't meant to be discovered immediately, but in the course of the investigation." Crail's eyes widened as he began to understand. "It wasn't just Mrs. Townsend or Delaford who had access to the tea. It was everyone in the book club." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. And that's why I've been so patient. I had to wait for the right moment to make it all clear." "But what does the sugar have to do with us?" Simon asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Miss Marple paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the room as she waited for the realization to hit. "Think carefully, Mr. Delaford," she said softly. "The sugar was tampered with by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who knew that Mrs. Marchmont's obsession with the rose-patterned cup would ensure that only she would use it. The air in the room grew thick with tension. The connections were beginning to form, but no one dared to voice the conclusion yet." Miss Marple continued. "When Mrs. Marchmont took that cup, she was meant to be the only one poisoned. But she wasn't. The rest of you were involved. Someone else had already tampered with the sugar before it was ever poured into the tea. But who?" A sudden realization hit Crail. "The maid," he said quietly. "Molly. She must have switched the sugar earlier that morning before anyone else arrived. She was trying to protect herself." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Not just protect herself, Inspector. She was trying to make sure no one ever found out who truly benefited from Mrs. Marchmont's death. The room fell silent as the weight of the truth sank in. I've been quiet because I knew this was the only way to uncover the full picture, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. Each of you, Mrs. Townsend, Miss Ashcroft, Mr. Delaford, had a hand in the death of Mrs. Marchmont. But the one who started it all, the one who manipulated the situation, was Molly. She knew exactly how to orchestrate the perfect crime. Long, heavy pause followed. Finally, Crail stood up and turned to Miss Marple. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. I'll make sure the proper arrangements are made." Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied smile. "The truth is always hidden, beneath the surface, but when you know what to look for, it always rises to the top." Chapter 10. The evening of the revelation passed in a strange, uneasy quiet. The villagers had dispersed, each of them left to digest the truth in their own way, while the shadow of Mrs. Marchmont's murder continued to loom large over Nether. Keyes Miss Marple, ever composed, sat by her fire, her knitting forgotten. Her eyes, sharp as ever, remained distant, reflecting on the pieces that had fallen into place with such precision. Yet, for all the satisfaction of solving the case, there was a quiet, unspoken weight she felt. This was not the resolution of a neat puzzle, but the unravelling of something more fragile, an intricate web of human frailty, and the subtle, insidious effects of secrets. The truth had come out. Molly had been the instigator, orchestrating the poison that killed Mrs. Marchmont, but not without assistance. The others had been drawn in, knowingly or unknowingly, by their own desires to protect themselves from exposure. Yet the real shock had been the extent to which each of them had allowed themselves to be swayed by fear and pride. No one was truly innocent in this. The consequences of their actions were now set in motion. Mrs. Townsend, once so poised, would have to answer for her role in the cover-up. Felicity Ashcroft, with her carefully cultivated reputation, would face the fallout of her decisions, and Simon Delaford, though not directly involved in the murder itself, would now have to confront the consequences of his own emotional entanglements. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Marple rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and opened it to find Inspector Crail standing in the doorway, his expression grave. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside, "I've just returned from the station. We've got everything sorted out. The truth is out now. We'll be moving forward with the investigation into Mrs. Townsend and the others." Miss Marple nodded but did not immediately speak. She gestured for him to sit, offering him a chair by the fire. "They'll be held accountable," Crail continued, settling into the chair, "and I'm sure the village will find a way to move past this eventually. But there's something about it all that doesn't sit right with me." "I understand," Miss Marple replied softly. "It's one thing to uncover the truth, Inspector, but another entirely to live with it. The consequences stretch far beyond the investigation. People will remember what happened here, and not just the crime. They'll remember the lies, the fear, the things they were willing to do to protect themselves." Crail's eyes narrowed. "So, you think? There's more to it than just the legal ramifications." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice tinged with an almost melancholic understanding. What we often fail to grasp, Inspector, is that the consequences of our actions extend far beyond what we can see. Even when the truth is revealed, it leaves ripples, affecting more than just the individuals directly involved. Creel's face softened, the hard edge of his earlier demeanour dissolving into something more reflective. I suppose I've always believed that justice could fix things, but you're saying that it's never that simple. No, it's never that simple, Miss Marple replied gently. Even when we uncover the truth, we leave something behind. In this case, it's the fragility of the village, the trust between people that's been shattered. It's like breaking a delicate porcelain cup, Inspector. Even when you put it back together, it's never quite the same. Creel sat back, his gaze fixed on the fire. The warmth of the room did little to ease the heavy realization settling over him. There's no going back, he muttered to himself. The damage is done. Miss Marple gave a soft smile, though her eyes remained thoughtful. The damage, yes, but also the chance for something new to begin. There will be healing eventually, but it will take time and it will take patience. There was a long silence between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the quiet murmur of the rain outside. Do you think it will ever be the same again? Creel asked, his voice quieter now. Miss Marple paused before answering, her gaze distant as though she could see beyond the walls of her cottage, beyond the village, to some deeper truth. No, she said finally. Not exactly the same, but that doesn't mean it's over. People change, and so do villages. They may not forget, but they will move on. There's always a way forward, even after the darkest moments. The key is not to pretend that the past didn't happen, but to learn from it. Creel nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in his expression. I suppose we all have our own ways of moving on, he said. Miss Marple looked at him with a knowing glance. Yes, and in some cases it's about finding peace with what we can no longer change. After a few moments, Creel rose from his chair. I'll leave you to your thoughts, Miss Marple. Thank you for all your help with this case. You've been more valuable than I ever could have imagined. Miss Marple gave a polite nod. It was my pleasure, Inspector. But remember, it's not always the case we solve that matters. It's the lives we touch along the way. As Creel left, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire. She stared into the flickering flames, her mind still circling back to the faces she had seen during the investigation. The fear, the guilt, the secret burdens carried by each person in the village. They would never forget what had happened, but life would continue, as it always did. The threads of human nature, tangled and complex, would always pull at the heart of things. And in the end, Miss Marple knew that the truth, while painful, was always worth uncovering. Because without it, no one could move forward. The village of Netherkeys would heal just as it always did. But the lessons learned here would linger in the hearts of those who remained, quiet, unspoken, but ever-present. Chapter 11. The days that followed the revelation of the murders settled into a peculiar calm, the kind of calm that follows after a storm has passed, leaving the air thick and damp with the residue of what was lost. Netherkeys, though forever marked by the tragic events, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of its own reflection. The village had weathered much, and yet it had not yet learned to fully reckon with the damage that had been done. Miss Marple, as always, continued her routine, unfazed by the world around her. She took her walks along the hedgerows, her eyes keenly observing the shifts in the village dynamics, the way neighbours spoke more quietly now, the way doors remained closed a little longer, as though the air outside had become too charged for comfort. It was early evening when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, one that she had not anticipated, yet felt strangely inevitable. Felicity Ashcroft arrived at her door, looking more composed than Miss Marple had seen her in days. The young woman's eyes were still shadowed with the weight of the past week, but there was a certain resolve about her now, a flicker of something Miss Marple had not seen before. Guilt had begun to yield to acceptance, and perhaps the possibility of redemption. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," Felicity began, her voice quieter than usual. "But I needed to speak with you. I've been thinking." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied warmly, stepping aside to let her in. "Please, come in. I've just finished my knitting for the day, but I'm sure there's still plenty of room for conversation." Felicity stepped inside, her movements careful, as though testing the waters of a world she no longer felt entirely familiar with. "I've been thinking about everything," she said, settling into a chair by the fire, "about what happened, about Mrs. Marchmont's death, and about Molly. I never meant for any of this to happen." Miss Marple studied her quietly, her hands resting in her lap. "None of us ever mean for things to spiral as they do we?" Felicity's lips quivered for a moment before she looked up. "I never meant to hurt anyone, not really. But I see now how everything just got out of hand. I thought I could control it, keep it all quiet, but I couldn't. And now Molly's dead. I can't stop thinking about it. The truth," Miss Marple said gently, "has a way of pulling us into places we're not prepared for. We don't often see it coming." Felicity nodded slowly, her face pale. "It wasn't just her, though. It was all of us. Mrs. Marchmont, Molly, and all the lies we told to protect ourselves. I don't know what to do with all of it." "Do you feel guilty?" Miss Marple asked, her tone soft but probing. "I do," Felicity admitted, her voice low. "I should have told the truth sooner. I should have helped Molly, not feared her. But I was scared that everything I had built, everything I thought was safe, would fall apart. And it did." "You're not the only one who felt fear," Miss Marple replied. "But fear alone doesn't cause people to make the choices you did. It's the desire to protect something. Our pride, our reputation, our sense of security, that makes us act in ways we later regret." Felicity's hands clenched in her lap. "Do you think I'll ever be able to make it right?" Miss Marple's gaze softened, and she sat forward, her voice steady but compassionate. "You've already taken the first step, Felicity. The first step is acknowledging the truth. The rest, that will take time. It will take work. But it's possible to rebuild, even from the darkest places." Felicity was silent for a moment, her eyes distant. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself for it all." "Forgiveness is a long road," Miss Marple said quietly. "But it starts with one thing: understanding that you cannot change what has happened. You can only change how you respond to it. Felicity nodded slowly, her gaze now focused on the fire. "I'll try, but I don't know if the village will ever trust me again." Miss Marple smiled gently, the warmth of her words reaching out. "Trust is fragile, yes, but it can be rebuilt if you are patient and honest with those around you." The conversation lingered between them as the fire crackled softly in the hearth. Miss Marple had always been the quiet observer, the one who saw beneath the surface. And now, in this moment, she understood the depth of what Felicity was facing. The world was not so simple as black and white. It was made of greys, and only through honesty and self-reflection could one begin to find clarity. After a long silence, Felicity finally stood, a determined look settling on her face. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for listening, for understanding." Miss Marple stood as well, her voice calm but firm. "You're welcome, my dear. Remember, the road to redemption is long, but it begins with the choices you make from this point onward." Felicity gave a small, hesitant smile before turning toward the door. "I'll do my best, I promise." As she left, the door closing softly behind her, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her gaze once again turning to the fire. She sat in the quiet warmth, thinking not just of the people she had helped solve mysteries for, but of the lessons they had taught her along the way. The village of Nether Keys would heal, but it would do so in its own time. Some would find peace, while others might never fully escape the shadows of their past. But for Miss Marple, the case had been more than just the solving of a murder. It had been a reminder of the delicate balance between truth and deception, between fear and forgiveness, and in the end, that was what mattered most. Chapter 12. A week had passed since the truth had come to light, and Nether Keys had begun to settle into the rhythm of life once again. The village, though forever marked by the scandal and the revelations, carried on. People exchanged pleasantries, with an air of polite restraint, and the world outside seemed to move at a faster pace, oblivious to the quiet unease that lingered just beneath the surface. Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the fire, the evening light waning as the village continued to wrestle with its new reality. The case was over, but the ripples of its consequences were still felt. In the stillness of her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the events that had unfolded, the lives that had been touched, for better or worse, and the lessons that once again life had offered. She had learned many things from the case, and the most important lesson was not about the poison, the lies, or even the murder itself. It was about the human heart, the way it could be both fragile and fierce, how the need for self-preservation could drive people to make choices they would never have imagined possible. The truth had come out, and those who had been involved had begun to face the consequences of their actions. Mrs. Townsend, despite her role in the cover-up, had been treated with a kind of reluctant empathy by the villagers. She had acted out of fear, a fear that Miss Marple understood all too well. Felicity Ashcroft, though still burdened by guilt, had begun the process of reconciling with herself and those she had wronged. And Simon Delaford, though distant and troubled, had returned to his writing, his pride now tempered with the realization of how easily one could lose everything. But the one who had truly been lost was Molly, the maid who had started it all, whose curiosity had set in motion a tragic chain of events. Miss Marple knew, as she sat there reflecting, that there would be no real justice for her, not in the way that some people might expect. She had paid the ultimate price for knowing, too much, for trying to uncover the things that others preferred to leave buried. The door creaked open, breaking Miss Marple's reverie. She looked up, surprised to see the familiar figure of Inspector Crail standing in the doorway, his face weary but resolute. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, stepping into the room. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm. "Please, come in. I was just thinking about the case. It seems that even after everything is resolved, the questions still linger." Crail took a seat across from her, his expression sombre. "You're right. It's been a strange few days. The village feels different now. There's a kind of quietness about it, as though everyone is still processing what happened. But I've been thinking about something else, too." "What's that, Inspector?" Miss Marple asked, her tone calm but curious. "I can't quite put my finger on it," Crail admitted, "but there's something about this case that doesn't feel finished. The answers we got, they make sense, but they don't tell the whole story. There's more to it than just a simple murder, more than just Molly's death. There's something deeper, something I missed." Miss Marple regarded him with her usual patient wisdom, her gaze steady. "Sometimes, Inspector, the answers we seek don't always come all at once. The truth, as you know, has a way of unfolding in its own time. And sometimes, when we think we've found the end, we realize that we're only at the beginning of a larger story." Crail looked down, as though considering her words carefully. "I suppose you're right, but it still feels like there's something we overlooked." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps what you missed was not a clue, Inspector, but a human moment, the way people act when they think no one is watching. It's in those moments, when they let their guard down, that we truly see the truth. It's never about the grand gestures, the big reveals. It's the little things that speak volumes." Crail exhaled, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "You've always had a way of seeing things that others don't." "I've had many years to observe people, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "and I've learned that no matter how complex a situation may seem, it always comes down to human nature in the end. Fear, pride, guilt, these are the things that drive people to do the unthinkable." There was a long silence between them as the fire crackled softly in the hearth. Crail looked deep in thought, as though Miss Marple's words were still echoing in his mind. "Do you think the village will ever be the same again?" he asked quietly, looking up at her. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "No, it won't be the same. But then it never was. Every village, every community changes with time. It's the nature of things. What matters is how people move forward, how they learn from their mistakes, and how they build something stronger from what has been broken." Crail nodded, the weight of the conversation settling on him. "I think I understand now. It's not about finding the perfect answer. It's about learning to live with what we've learned." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Exactly, Inspector. Life is not a series of neat, tidy solutions. It's messy and unpredictable. But it's in that messiness that we find the most valuable lessons." Crail stood, his shoulders slightly less burdened than when he had entered. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything. You've given me more to think about than I could have imagined." Miss Marple nodded. "It's always a pleasure to help, Inspector. But remember, when you think you've found all the answers, sometimes it's best to step back and listen. The truth often speaks in the quietest of voices." As Crail left the cottage, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, her mind still turning over the events of the past days. She had solved the mystery, yes, but the work of understanding and accepting the human heart would never be finished. For in the end, Miss Marple knew that the greatest mystery of all was not you to do, one that could be solved with logic and deduction. It was the mystery of why people do the things they do, and how, despite everything, they still manage to find a way to move forward. And so, as the fire flickered out and the village of Netherkeys slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, Miss Marple sat in quiet reflection, content in the knowledge that the truth had been uncovered, and that the village, though forever changed, would find its way again.